The Ninth. Written by Christopher Cartwright. Narrated by David Gilmore. 23rd May, 2003. Khyber Pass, Afghanistan. The Black Hawk cleared the Spingar Mountains, and then banked heavily to the left before descending into the Khyber Pass, once the keystone of the ancient Silk Road and the oldest known pass in the world. In the passenger compartment, 8 elite soldiers of the U.S. Navy SEAL Team's Omega unit sat making last-minute checks on their weapons and equipment. Their mission, to hold the uppermost level of the Dragon's Lair, a 4,000-year-old stronghold that had shown little military significance until now. Each man knew what was required of him, had gone over the drills more than 30 times, and was capable of making each maneuver regardless of the events outside their control every time. The Omega team had been together for 4 years. They were close, and each of them had requested a second tour of duty before their turn had come up. Then there was the 9th man, the only one who didn't belong. As a Marine, Sam Riley trained as a helicopter pilot, not with the Special Forces. As a civilian, he was the only remaining son of shipping mogul James Riley. Sam was an expert cave diver with a doctorate in marine biology and a most eligible bachelor. It was his background as a cave diver that made him their first choice for inclusion on this mission. He was on his first tour of duty, and had only been in the sand pit for a little over 3 weeks now. This was to be the first time he'd even set foot on these mountains. He sat relaxed in the back of the chopper. While the men around him checked their weapons, Sam casually scrolled through his digital notepad, about half the size of an average iPad, and infinitely more robust and powerful. He was viewing more than 20 high-resolution images, which had been found painted on the walls of a recent archaeological dig in Cairo and built by an ancient civilization once known as the Master Builders. When placed together, the pictures formed a map. Of all the men aboard the chopper, it was his mission alone that would have a real effect on the outcome of America's future military might. But today his mission had little to do with the war on terrorism. Unlike the men around him, his mission wasn't about winning the match. It was about gaining technology so far advanced that the game would be over. Sam put his notepad into his left cargo pocket and removed a small golden trinket, no bigger than a hummingbird. Made of solid gold, its weight seemed unnaturally heavy for something that felt comfortable held within the palm of his hand. He examined it again, for the 100th time this week. It was sculpted in the form of a pyramid, each block made of solid gold. At the base of the trinket was an emblem, now known to be that of the Master Builders. The emblem depicted 4 horsemen carrying spears, and at its center there was a godlike man holding a chisel and standing upon an hourglass, most likely depicting the Master Builder's power over the armies of the world for all time. From what little had been discovered about the ancient civilization, they were believed to be the longest lasting in history, having survived for many thousands of years without ever raising an army of their own. It was amazing that a recent archaeological discovery in Cairo might hold the answers to an ancient mystery. Fascinating, Sam thought, before casually placing the trinket back inside his cargo pants pocket and zipping it shut. In the distance he could see the dragon's teeth scattered along the valley floor, old concrete blocks which had been abandoned there, having once been used to stop the movement of German tanks during the Second World War. They were getting close. "Omega Team, ETA to drop zone 3 minutes," the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Each member of the team acknowledged their readiness. Over the crest of the next hill, Sam got his first real glimpse of the ancient walled city. Nearly 4,000 years of fighting had failed to destroy the stronghold which had been built into the Afghan mountain, although that was in part because it had served very little purpose for the Westerners until now. The place had been carved into the mountain range more than 4 millennia ago at the behest of an ancient tribal chieftain whose tribe was said to have ruled the land for many centuries. The stronghold was built and comprised of a multitude of incorporated cave systems, forever reaching deeper into the mountain. Intelligence report identified that there were in excess of 5 main barrier systems, each one stronger and better protected than the one before. In this way, the men defending it could always retreat, regroup, and then maintain the advantage over any incoming forces. Early on, during the War on Terrorism, the U.S. Air Force spent weeks making satellite-targeted hits. But like ants after their nest had been kicked, the warriors always returned, because the stronghold was built so deeply into the mountain for protection. Whoosh! Whoosh! 2 air-to-ground missiles, followed by the sound of the helicopter's twin Gatling guns, fired at the mountain directly ahead of them. This served only to deter any would-be spies from straying too far from the entrance, while the helicopter descended close enough to the ground for the men to disembark. It was a hot drop, the kind where the helicopter blades never stop turning and the skids don't touch the ground. The pilot hovered a foot in the air, and the troops jumped to the earth. Sam Riley was the last man to set foot on the rocky ground. His feet crunched into the shale surface. He'd piloted more than a dozen of these missions before, but this was the first time his feet had touched the ground. He'd never been specifically trained as a foot soldier. Standing at exactly 6 feet, he was only slightly taller than the average man, but his arms and shoulders were wide after years of physical labor, and his legs were like tree trunks, giving him the appearance of being solid and wiry, labor which the sea had demanded of him. Beneath his Kevlar helmet and Perspex eye protection, he had pensive, dark blue eyes, and the sort of cheeky smile that says, "I can have it all." If life had taught him anything, it was that he, of all people, could. His eyes also showed his quiet determination, while the calluses on his hands displayed the tenacity required to make things happen. Sam would be on his own for this mission. The thought made him happy. He felt confident in his own abilities, and he trusted his instincts. He followed SEAL Team Omega until they reached the bridge. On the other side was an enormous iron door, standing 40 feet high. Ironically, while it remained standing, the walls surrounding it had been destroyed by the recent American bombing raids. The place appeared to be deserted, but Sam's intel told him otherwise. Sam watched as the other members of his team quickly passed the bridge that reached over the divide and made it into the first level of the stronghold. He approached the bridge. Sam paused halfway across, just long enough for his eyes to examine the deeply green water below, the limestone from the mountain seeping into and coloring the still water. Its narrow section looked enticingly unnatural in the surrounding desert. It was man-made, of course, and served to protect the entrance both spiritually and physically. As casually as a man leaving his house for a walk, Sam donned his face mask and jumped, disappearing into the water 15 feet below. The water made a small splash as Sam pin-dived through its still surface and kept sinking. He had ensured that his equipment was set to neutral buoyancy before leaving the base. He knew how deep the water was, but it still amazed him as he sunk to the bottom of the 250-foot ancient man-made abyss below. It was no more than 5 feet wide and 30 feet long at its longest point. The edges of the rock walls were sharp, and although they may have been there for thousands of years, They still bore evidence of the crude tools used in their making. It wasn't until he'd reached the dark bottom of the abyss that Sam switched on his headlight and camera. Below him were the skeletal remains of more than 100 failed intruders to the stronghold, a grisly reminder of the price of failure. Sam didn't let his mind mull over the concept. He swam to the western tip of the cavern and back to the eastern tip, looking for his target. After failing to find it, he repeated the process. His heart rate increased, just slightly. If he couldn't find it, the SEAL team above would have no choice but to abandon their mission, leaving him on his own in a world where death was often the better option. It took all his control to ensure that panic didn't take over. Finally, he spotted it. At first, he didn't recognize what he was looking at. The door had almost entirely melded with the limestone rock wall. Sam took his gloved hand and firmly ran his index finger through the grooves that marked the outlined edges of the door. It was small, spanning no more than 4 feet tall by 4 feet wide, a perfect square. Sam felt confident that he had reached the first level of the secret chamber. Gently, Sam pushed against the door. Despite being small, it was made of solid rock, which was more than 2 feet thick. No human could possibly push the door open without mechanical assistance. He took out his electronic pad and scrolled through the images until he reached the one depicting a small rock door. Sam had no reason to believe that the door pictured matched the one in front of him, but there was no other image of a door that resembled the one facing him on any of the other images that he'd been sent, so he continued. He examined the image carefully. There should have been 13 different pictographs sculpted into the door. 4 horsemen carrying spears, pointed outwards. 4 snakes facing inwards towards the images of 4 naked women, bent in supplication towards the center image, and a final pictograph of a naked warrior. Sam looked at the central image again and decided that it might be a depiction of their god. He ran his hand across the door at the top left-hand side, where the first horseman should have been, clearing away more than 4,000 years of accumulated silt. As it cleared, and he was able to see it a little more distinctly, he was relieved to find the saddle of the first horseman right where it belonged. Thank the gods! Sam felt his heart rate decrease a little. He knew how to overcome the first obstacle. Quickly cleaning the next carvings, Sam thought for a second that he could see the flicker of another light approaching him. He turned. His powerful head-mounted torch showed newly disturbed silt in the water, but nothing else. Sam chided himself for his weak nerves and returned to his work. Time was of the utmost importance. No one could possibly have followed him down here. It was too deep. He cleaned another 2 pictographs before he saw it again. This time, the creature didn't retreat when he shined his torchlight on it. Instead, it came in fast, for the kill. Oh, shit! Above him, the giant eel was more than 12 feet long, with teeth that more accurately resembled an alligator's than an eel's. Its mouth opened up with lightning speed as it attacked. Sam reached into his dive vest to retrieve a weapon. Unfortunately, he was too slow, and the creature latched onto his torso with a vice-like crunch. The carbon fiber dive tank he wore, which had been molded to fit the contours of his body, was the only thing that saved his life. The startled creature gnawed at it for a couple of seconds. Those few seconds were just long enough for Sam to retrieve a small metal object that looked more like an electric razor than anything resembling a military weapon. He pointed it towards the dangerous creature and squeezed the trigger. It glowed blue. 5 seconds later, the color disappeared entirely. No visible discharge could be seen leaving the weapon, but an instant later the giant eel convulsed and then stopped dead. The confrontation had been enough to alert other predators of the presence of an easy meal. Above him, more than a dozen glowing eyes could be seen approaching. Sam reproached himself for not taking the ancient writing seriously. After 4,000 years, he had assumed that any eels brought here by the stronghold's original masters would have long since died. Instead, they had been fed by the generations of failed intruders and successful conquerors until they evolved to their current gigantic length. He glanced down at his weapon. It was still glowing, ready to discharge again. 6 bars remained active, indicating that he could use it another 6 times. Sam's eyes glanced up at the dozen or more eyes approaching him. 6 shots would never be enough to kill them all. He grabbed the carcass of the dead eel and pushed it towards the approaching creatures. Returning to his work at the door, he witnessed the animals tearing apart the dead beast. This time, he didn't have the luxury of examining each image. He had to take the gamble, and if he got it right, he would live. If not, he would join the throng of other unsuccessful intruders into the stronghold. With each of the 4 horsemen visible, and the godlike image of a naked man at the center, he rotated the spears of each horseman, which originally pointed outward and symbolized the protection of the naked man from intruders, so that they now pointed inwards towards the god. Almost there. Suddenly he felt excruciating pain as one of the vicious animals latched onto his foot. His sturdy commando boot was all that saved it from being bitten clean off. He turned and once again squeezed the trigger of his electric weapon. It discharged, and he felt the animal jolt at the end of his rubber boot. In the distance he could see the other animals take interest. Sam pushed the dead animal toward them, and with a silent prayer to a god that he didn't believe in, he pushed against the image of the naked man. This time the image moved freely as he depressed it all the way into the door. Nothing else happened, and Sam thought for certain that he'd just signed his own death warrant. Then the door moved inwards, as simple but effective ancient mechanisms dragged the rock door 10 feet into the mountain behind it, exposing the entrance to a small tunnel and a staggered stone staircase. Sam swam inside and climbed the dozen or more submerged steps. His head broke free of the surface, and he clambered up above the waterline until he was entirely free of the water below him. The surface appeared thick and dark in color. It took him a second to realize that the masters of this level of the labyrinth had intentionally left a thick oil slick along the surface of the water, but for what purpose he was afraid to find out. Nothing so far had been left to chance. The original builders had planned everything to perfection. Sam looked at his watch. The oxygen level was just 15%, a little lower than normal, and the nitrogen level was at 80%, with the residual makeup of the air being primarily comprised of trace gases and excess carbon dioxide. It wasn't ideal, but it was still breathable. Sam removed his face mask and tentatively took an unassisted breath for the first time in 20 minutes. He looked around the room. It was large enough that he could stretch out. The walls were made entirely from granite, a rock not commonly found within the area, and which was most likely brought in from hundreds of miles away when the great builders came to this site. The ceiling was 7 or more feet tall, and the room was a perfect square of approximately 20 by 20 feet. The southern end of the room was empty, with the exception of the small stairs which Sam had just scaled, and a rudimentary axe, the head of which was made entirely of flint, on the wall next to the entrance. Sam's eyes returned once again to the thick oil slick floating on top of the water below. "Yeah, I don't think I want to touch you." In front of him, set into the north, east, and west walls of the chamber, were rows of 3 doors, each with apparently identical markings, similar to those found on the door through which he had just entered. The only exception was that at the center of each of the 9 doors, In place of the godlike man image was depicted a naked water nymph, her palms turned upwards, enticing the viewer to enter and follow her. Riley reached into his pocket and withdrew his electronic notepad. Scrolling through it offered very little in the way of assistance. Somehow, he assumed that the answer would present itself once he was there. The only note that he could find was a 4,000-year-old Egyptian message, which had been translated to read, "Choose wisely. False kings will die." It was, Sam felt, a wholly useless statement. The entire place had been set up to kill intruders. Sam didn't need a translation of an ancient rune to inform him that any mistake made here would almost certainly lead to his sudden and painful demise. He calmly shook his head, cursing his own government's brightest archaeologists, who had been the ones to provide him with the intel for this mission. Next time, let's see how bright you guys are when it's your life you're gambling with. Sam calmly approached the first door and examined its markings. With the exception of the water nymph, the door was identical to the first one he had crossed. He took a quick photo with his camera, and then looked at the one door next to him. Again, it was identical to the last. He continued this process until he had photographed all 9 doors. To the naked eye, they all appeared identical. He then launched his hieroglyphics deciphering program and selected Find Differences. The program ran for 2 minutes and then provided him with the answer. Sam scrolled through each result, feeling more and more confident. There were 3 differences. 1, all the water nymphs had their eyes open except for one. It would make sense for the creature that was betraying its king to have its eyes shut. 2, all the horsemen carried their spears in their right hands, with the exception of the one to the left of the water nymph with closed eyes. Clearly, this has been broken in the past 4,000 years. Sam's eyes scanned the ground and found several powdered dust piles. Any one of them was likely to be a remnant of the fallen spear. 3, the ground in front of the blind water nymph was discolored, as though some air had moved through that part of the room. Sam still had one more test he wanted to perform before he made his final determination and applied it by risking his life. He'd seen the other side of the open door on the archaeological image, which had been drawn by someone who had witnessed the building of this maze millennia ago. At the time it didn't appear to serve much use, but now he could view it and see that it matched up to the door bearing the image of the blind nymph. Before he scrolled through to the third image, another giant eel slithered its way up the stairs. "Fuck me," Sam said out loud. Reaching into his vest, he fired at the beast with his electrical weapon, killing it instantly. It rolled back down the stairs into the oil-slicked water. Before Sam could move towards the blind water nymph, 3 more giant eels had taken the place of the previous one. He again pulled the trigger on his weapon. Only 1 bar remained on the side. His weapon was about to run out of energy. And now he could see the movement of more than a dozen of these great beasts. He remembered the ancient axe made of flint. So that's why they left this here. Sam didn't hesitate to consider the repercussions of his theory, nor did he consider the fact that the master builders had never built the secret chamber to allow intruders the option of gaining access to the king's chamber, and as such the most simple and obvious solution was often likely to be the most fatal. He slammed the axe into the top step, and the oil ignited instantly. In the chamber around him, Sam could hear the squealing of more than a dozen giant eels burning. He hadn't even set the axe back on the ground before he realized that he had just walked straight into the builder's fatal trap. He had beaten the attack of the violent eels, but now the flames would quickly deprive the secret chamber of oxygen, and even if the hypoxia didn't kill him immediately, It was heating up the air so quickly that within a minute or less the entire chamber would become so overheated it would kill him. With his hand still gripping the axe, Sam ran towards the door at the northern end of the chamber, the one marked at the center with the image of a blind water nymph. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was reluctant to relinquish the only tool that the builders had left for him. Did they leave it here only to kill me? But by now, Sam had developed a unique understanding of the wise men who had built this labyrinth. It would be fitting and appropriate with their practices to leave a tool of necessity, easily accessible at the second level, to which I may never return, and which might prove to be vitally necessary at the third or fourth level. Reaching the door, Sam decided to forego his initial urge to review the old image of the third level of the secret chamber. Without hesitation, he pushed the naked blind water nymph until it slid inside the door. Nothing. 5 seconds later, the door slowly began to move forward. Thank you. He quickly stepped into the next room. Whoosh! A strong gush of air almost pulled his feet off the ground. With the air no longer sealed within the chamber, the water was now free to force its way up into equilibrium, and in so doing flood the entire area. Sam had to work out the third puzzle quickly if he were to survive it. He looked around the room. It was small, very small, too small. The room was barely large enough for him to turn his body around. Sam looked up, and he immediately saw his mistake. Above him was a tunnel, which reached for the surface. Somewhere in the distance there was a flicker of sunlight. The water, he guessed, would eventually rise to settle about 200 feet above his head. Directly above him were 9 full-size horsemen, their iron spears all pointed downward. If he acted fast, Sam could choose the cause of his own death, either by impalement on those spears once the water rushed through the tunnel, or burning to death on the flaming oil, or by drowning. But he would have to make his choice quickly, because the water was going to reach him within mere seconds. He made his decision, and quickly began to fight his way through the fast-moving air which whirled through the door. The master builders could never have known that 4,000 years after they completed the secret chamber, military-grade diving equipment would be developed. He placed on his face mask and dived through the fire and down the submerged staircase. If he'd accidentally touched the superheated flaming water for more than a second, it would have burnt him savagely, but as he dived through, he felt no pain. It took little more than a minute for the water to flood the secret chamber and rise up the tunnel until it reached equilibrium. He held onto an iron bolt at the base of the stairs, worried that the rising water was going to suck his body through the spears. Sam Riley had no intention of getting himself killed today. Once the water had settled completely, he took out his electronic notepad and found what he had been looking for. The view from the third of the secret chambers. It became clear the instant he looked at it that the door with the missing spearhead was always the correct door. After double-checking his work, Sam pushed against the naked water nymph, hoping that it would still work despite the additional water pressure from the flooding. It took more than 10 seconds for the mechanism to work, and this time the door moved more than a dozen feet inside. The instant the door opened, Sam was washed through with the water behind him. When he was 10 feet inside the new tunnel, several tons of stone rubble fell behind him, sealing the tunnel completely. The small amount of water which had already washed through the opening splashed unhindered on the ground further up the passageway. Sam braced himself and the axe that he was now almost certain he would soon need. The third level of the secret chamber was very different in comparison to the other chambers. By any measure, it was enormous, a cavern half the size of a football field and at least 50 feet high. It consisted of a tunnel more than 30 feet long, leading to a gigantic room with 4 separate spiral stone staircases at the corners, leading to the ceiling above. The walls formed a perfect square. Those guys sure had something with a number 4. Within the square stood 64 rectangular vertical columns, each one varying in height, the purpose of which, Sam imagined, would allow the intruder to jump from one to the next until reaching the 4th level and the final challenge of the secret chamber. Below each column were set hundreds of iron spears, reaching for the sky and the would-be failed and fallen intruder. Along the walls, ground, and columns ran hundreds of long, continuous drawings. Only they weren't drawings such as the ones he'd seen the master builders create previously. These appeared to be more like a child's crayon markings, having no apparent purpose. However, the master builders never built anything without it having a purpose. Nothing more, nothing less. Simple perfection. That's fine. Its purpose will present itself to me when the time is right. He ran his hand along the groove in the wall. It wasn't a surface marking, he realized. Instead, it was as though something had made a tiny tunnel by eating away at the limestone walls, ground, and columns, something akin to what one would find inside a giant termite tunnel. The thought sent a small shiver down his spine. At the center of the room, the final and tallest column could be seen. Above it, the only light source for the entire room entered from the ceiling. It was a bright light that appeared to shoot straight down onto the top of the center column and then moderately dissipate its light around the room. Built on this column was the base of a small pyramid, perhaps 6 feet high and made of granite. At the very top of that pyramid, there appeared to be one tiny block missing. I've seen that missing piece before. Sam pulled the golden trinket from inside his right cargo pocket. Without looking further, he now knew just where it belonged. Without wasting any more time, he started to walk up the first set of steps. Sam picked the first set of steps at random. After all, they all appeared to be equal, and as far as he could tell from the ground, each allowed the occupant to reach the central column. The formations didn't change appearance as he climbed the steps, not until he reached the top of the 50-odd-foot-high stone staircase, where he stopped to take in the entire room for the first time, and their purpose suddenly became clear. Close up, the markings formed no obvious depiction of anything. From the top, viewed all together, they created a perfect optical illusion, making it impossible for the viewer to determine the distance, height, or even the location of each column. He wished he had brought with him a bag of sand to throw over the columns, but he hadn't, and the masters had not left any behind. Sam thought about it for a while, and then, without anything better to do, tried the next staircase, followed by the next, until he'd seen the room from all 4 angles. The masters, Sam thought, had intentionally made each task extremely difficult, but they had always left the means with which to solve the puzzle. He struggled as he tried to think outside the box in which he was presently trapped. Then it struck him. By assessing each view from a different vantage point, the intruder could use the right angle of the squares to determine the exact distance between each column and its height. By copying these to paper, one could in time predict the locations and the only correct course through the maze. In Sam Riley's case, it was even easier than that. By taking a photograph from each angle on his notepad, the computer could then provide the correct height and location of each column. Once this was done, the route was clear. While he now had a map which identified the only real route through the columns, showing the exact distance that he had to jump to reach the next column, he still found it unnerving to not be able to see it with his own eyes before he jumped. Each jump literally felt as though he were jumping to his death. Slowly, he managed to make his way through the mysterious maze of columns. In time, he was also able to better determine how far he had to jump in order to cross each subsequent gap, the specific distance highlighted for him by his notepad prior to making each jump. As he approached the longer gaps, it became clear to him that he was going to have to lose some of the weight he was carrying. By the time he reached the fifth and final gap, he had removed all of his equipment, with the exception of the gold trinket, his notepad, and axe, which he still believed must serve a purpose. The final gap, which landed on the bottom level of the small pyramid, was by far the longest. Sam was an athletic man, but he very much doubted that he could make the jump from a standing start. No, the only way that he could achieve such a jump would be with a running start, and in order to do this, he would need to jump the 3 previous columns in succession before making the final jump. He stared at the tops of the columns ahead of him. Each one appeared to be set at the same distance apart, but his computer assured him that they were not. Sam took a couple of deep breaths and then started to run for it. First jump, second jump, third jump, and then the final leap. He cleared the divide, which seemed to go on forever, his hands only just reaching the lowest layer of masonry below the pyramid. Sam didn't wait to lose his grip and immediately pulled himself up. Carefully climbing to the highest point atop the pyramid, he pulled out the golden trinket and placed it on the peak of the pyramid where it obviously belonged. The light above him remained the same, but the direction of the light across the pyramid now reflected off the glowing golden trinket and began to light up the entire room. Sam looked around, searching for a sign, certain that the purpose of the pyramid was more than to merely brighten the room. Then he saw it. On the ceiling, several columns behind him, the light was specifically targeting one spot, and through this mark ran a thick line from one of the illusory formations. Did they serve a double purpose? It wouldn't be the first time the master builders had used the same device for multiple purposes. There was only one way to find out. But how could he possibly make the jump across the greatest gap without taking a running start? He was trapped on top of the highest point. With the solution in sight, Sam fought his own frustration as he tried to develop a means of getting to it. Then it struck him. His notebook program had produced the only possible safe route up to the pyramid. Would a different route have been identified had he also set the program to identify the safest route down? Less than a minute later, he found that there were a number of closer but shorter columns on the opposite side of the pyramid than the one he had started from. He would never have been able to use them to jump up to it, but coming down was a different matter. Once he reached the ground, his confidence growing, Sam ran to the closest set of stairs and traced his way back to the column his program identified as number 44. The light still glowed directly at the same point. No mistake could be made. The masters had left a telltale sign at that point, but for what purpose? He pushed against it, but it didn't move at all. Following his gut instinct, he took the axe and swung it directly at the mark. Sparks flew as it cut into the stone. Flames erupted along the small tunnels, like a million dominoes falling. It followed the intricate and erratic flow of the formations. Next followed explosions at the bases of 4 of the other columns, causing each of them to fall toward the northern end of the square cavern and come to rest atop a set of shorter columns, which until that moment appeared to serve no purpose whatsoever, but which now formed a bridge to a single part of the wall ahead. That wall glowed the hottest. For a minute, Sam became concerned that the ancient mechanism had failed to achieve its purpose. But then 4 more explosions occurred, and a new door opened outward. The columns were easy to jump now that the illusory markings had been burned off and thus disappeared. Within 5 minutes, Sam walked through the large doors and entered the 4th chamber, the King's Chamber. Although not as expansive as the previous one, the King's Chamber resonated with wealth and power. In the center, where he imagined a violent king once slept, was a sarcophagus, intricately adorned with precious gemstones. Sam carefully walked toward it in awe. Examining the rich historical discovery and the wealth of precious gemstones which had not been seen by human eyes in nearly 4 millennia, Sam was taken in by the enormous power that flowed around and emanated from the room. On top of the sarcophagus was carved a bas-relief of a single man brandishing a spear. Sam tentatively touched the spear, and it moved. A sound could be heard in the distance. Sam had heard that sound before. It was the sound of many ancient mechanisms at work. He turned around to prepare himself for the next test. To his horror, a man entered the room. He was wearing a plain gray suit and a necktie, but there was something familiar in his appearance. Sam instinctively reached for his weapon, but his pistol was gone. He had left it at the top of the 3rd level, along with the rest of his equipment, but fortunately he had kept his light electrical weapon. He quickly drew the electric depolarizing weapon, which had 1 discharge remaining. "That won't be necessary," the man said, in perfect American English. "Shit, Colonel, I nearly killed you." The man was not actually his colonel, but rather someone his father had once known more than 20 years ago. He'd most likely been looking into buying several $1 billion worth of ships for the U.S. Navy back then. Something about his eyes had never let Sam forget the man. He was obviously intelligent, but there was something almost sinister about his intention to attain even more power. "Yes, well, I'm very glad you didn't. What I'm about to offer makes you worth far more to us now than you would be if you were rotting in some prison." Sam still hadn't fully taken in the colonel's statement yet. The colonel ignored his blank look and continued speaking. "You took your time, Mr. Riley. For a while there I wasn't certain you were going to make it, but you did. Well done. As of 2 hours ago, you were formally discharged from the U.S. Marines. You will speak directly only to myself and the Secretary of Defense, and always at our choosing, never at your own." "What are you talking about, sir?" "You're to be moved stateside, where your training will begin immediately. No one will ever know about the services you provide for your country. On their behalf, may I congratulate you and thank you." The man moved to walk away without saying anything else. "Colonel?" "Yes." The man sounded irritated at being interrupted. "Do we know what happened to the civilization of the master builders?" "No. And that's one of the things we need you to find out." This has been the 9th. Written by Christopher Cartwright. Narrated by David Gilmour. Copyright 2020 by Christopher Cartwright. Production copyright 2020 by Christopher Cartwright. Thank you for listening.